So the second of these 5 lectures that we're going to have, this one sort of is quite honestly one that I love to give, and so this is sort of driven by me. I am going to ask you guys in polls for what topics you would like. I'll give you a choice of topics for the last 3, and I'm going to really try to pick ones that fit in your wheelhouse. But this one's a little bit in my wheelhouse. It's something I love to do, mess with students' heads. Now, you'll see the reason why as we go through. But we're really going to connect 2 weird things. Not weird things, but 2 things. This issue of climate change, and specifically the whole question of what can we do about it? What should we do about it? So what's the psychology around trying to get people to do something about something like climate change? And how does it connect to something as simple as the ethics of animal research? I'm going to suggest to you that there is a connection and that our scientific community needs to be doing something now, in my opinion, to really kind of pave the way for a more appropriate public response to climate change. So, don't want to go too far ahead. Let's just jump here. I assume most of you have heard about this climate change thing. It's somehow been a little overshadowed by COVID, something maybe worse or at least more immediate. But in the background, it's there, and we're seeing it all the time in forest fires. We're seeing it in the storms that are happening. We know the temperature of the earth is rising. We know that's going to lead to all sorts of horrible things. And let's be clear at the outset, it's not about us saving the earth. Okay, the earth will be fine. I guarantee you, thousands of years from now, there will still be an earth. What we're trying to do is save our privileged spot on the earth. We are the sort of dominant species on this planet. But if we mess up enough and we make the planet uninhabitable, the planet will be fine. It'll be us that will be in trouble, us and potentially other animals and critters that inherit the earth. And so really this is something that's an existential threat to our species, and our species should be responding to it. Now, one of the things I'll just mention at the outset, near the end of our course, we're going to talk a little bit about problem solving. And one of the things you're going to learn is that humans really suck at problem solving when the problem is abstract and distant. They need a concrete thing right in front of them, and then humans are good. If they have a concrete problem, they can work around. But when it's abstract and when it's kind of in the future somewhere, we have a lot of trouble sort of thinking well and problem solving well about it. We do better than any other animal. Very few animals can think into the future much at all. But it's a real challenge for us. And climate change is one of those things. Right? It's abstract. It's not like Godzilla where you can send fighter planes after it. It's this weird thing. And it seems like the only thing that's going to do anything about it is us sort of changing the way we're living in some way. And so that's going to be the challenge psychologically. How do you change? How do you get a group of humans to change the way they're living? Now, of course, some of you might say, hey, but this is controversial. Is this about human behavior at all? Because you hear a lot of the stuff out there, the climate change deniers, saying, no, this is just would happen anyway. There are cycles. It's got nothing to do with our behavior. I would put it to you that book has been closed for a while, but I'll just show you some data here where they were able to simulate the sort of so-called natural factors that could lead climates to vary and separate those out from a situation where you simulate both those natural factors and you also include human factors. When you only do the natural factors, you expect this little line of variations in temperature, and yeah, it does vary naturally, just like people say. There will be some hotter, there'll be some lower. But you see it sort of varies around 0. But what we're seeing is this maroon line, I guess, where you see observed. That's what the temperatures are actually doing, and the only models that fit that are ones that include human factors. So, the things that we are doing on this planet. So there's very little doubt in the scientific community that it's our behavior that's driving this. The good news about that is if we change our behavior, we can change this function. So there's an optimistic part to that. That's what we're going to talk a lot about today. How hard is it for people to change their behavior in some cases? And how do you think through what that change should be? Okay, so I'm curious to start with where all of you guys are. So this is the other thing with this Top Hat app. I can occasionally ask you questions like this. You will see those, you'll be able to access those on the app. So right now on that list, you'll see an even possible thing where you can click on that and you can pick which option you want and submit. The nice thing about that, and I'll ask you guys when these questions come in to try to do that kind of quickly, because I'll wait for a little while. But also, by the way, those of you watching the live stream, you can do the same thing, right? That should be on your app. You should have that question, that option to answer along. And so you kind of see people answering along on the bottom here. I sometimes won't wait for everybody because, I don't know, I won't. Those last stragglers take a while. So try not to be one of the last stragglers if you want your data to be shown. But let's just see where people are at. Okay. A lot of people in the C category. I would put myself in the C category. Let me talk to you about the D category first. I want to talk to you about that for two reasons. One, just so you get this concept, a concept called learned helplessness, but also so that we start talking about animal research and animal models. So this is one of the experiments I most dislike speaking about, and yet it's such a critical experiment. It's an important one to know and to understand the power of. So this is an experiment by somebody named Martin Seligman. Martin Seligman worked with dogs, and he had this special chamber he created. Imagine it sort of like a big box with two sides. There was floors under the sides that were metallic. There were lights on either side. And what he did early on, if you come on in if you want to come to the lecture. Come on in, it's okay. Where's our sign-in person? She left? Oh, you already signed in? Or you didn't sign in?
No, I didn't sign. I'm just sort of like finding passwords.
I'm confused. Okay, there we are. Excellent. Can you just check off? Are you trying to be an intro psych, or are you just here?
No, I'm just
okay. Just wander around. Sorry. Okay, so there would be the chamber with the two sides. And what the first step was the following. He would put a light on one of the sides. And very shortly after he put the light on, so whatever side the dog was on, the light would come on. And then very shortly after that, the floor of that side would electrify. It's not, enough to make the dog go zap or anything like that. It's just a little bit of an electrical current, but all living things hate that feeling of electrical current. And dogs absolutely hate it as well. So the dog would very quickly learn that relationship, something called classical conditioning. We'll talk about it in a little bit. So it would learn if the light comes on, the floor is about to be electrified, and so it would very quickly show an escape response. The light would come on, it would jump off that floor before it was electrified. Okay, cool. Here's where it gets a little not so cool. At that point, they erect a barrier between the two sides. So now the dog cannot escape. So the dog sees the light coming on, it knows a shock is coming, and the first few trials, it tries really hard to escape. It tries to find every way it can around, above the barrier. But what happens eventually over a number of trials when it's unable to escape, so it tries and fails, tries and fails, tries and fails, after enough failures, it just rolls in a ball in the corner. And so when the light comes on, it just takes the shock. It just lays there and says, go ahead, hit me with the freaking shock. Here's the sort of kicker. If you now remove the barrier, so this animal has reached a point that Seligman calls learned helplessness. It's learned that it's not able to do anything about the situation, so it stops trying. And even when you remove the barrier now, and the light comes on, the dog no longer tries to escape. It's just given up any desire to even try to escape the situation it's in. Okay, first of all, with climate change, this is tricky because I'm going to talk about the fact that we're trying to do some things, but we're failing. We're seeing repeated failures. So there's one worry that we will reach this point with climate change, and we will stop trying. And that's a really bad place to be. Okay, that learned helplessness is kind of like a burnout cycle and a stress cycle, etc. It's when what Martin Seligman said originally is this could be an animal model of depression. So let me talk to you about animal models a bit, so you have the sense of that. Let's say you were interested in studying epilepsy, and let's say you had some drugs that you thought might help somebody who might have an epileptic seizure. You would like to do some research on that. Okay, people say, well, you have to do the research on animals first. Okay, cool. How do you find epileptic animals? Do you like wander around they often use rabbits for this research, by the way. Do you just wander around the woods waiting to find some rabbit having a seizure somewhere and going, woohoo, I got one? How long would it take you to find any number of epileptic rabbits, real rabbits with real epilepsy? Obviously that's almost impossible. And so what most researchers do is they create what's called an animal model. They find a way to create the disease in the animal. And with epilepsy, you can do that through a procedure called long-term potentiation. We don't need to get in the details here, but if you pass a current between two parts of the brain enough times, that pathway becomes really strong and that current starts to pass back and forth really quickly, and that's ultimately what epilepsy is. It's the brain short-circuiting because an electrical current is in a feedback loop in the brain. Whole brain gets electric. That's why you see people, by the way, having spasms on the floor, because their motor cortex is being stimulated, and so that's pushing their body all around in various ways. And so you can create this in a rabbit. You can literally, across a number of days, get the rabbit to a point where you can literally flip a switch and it has a seizure, which is handy if you're doing research, because now you can give some rabbits a certain drug, other rabbits not, flip the switches, see if the ones with the drug have a weaker or no seizure compared to the other ones, right? So that's the sort of scientific process. It's one thing with medical conditions. Seligman was trying to do that for psychological conditions. He was trying to say learned helplessness is like a model of depression. We can make an animal depressed by putting them through a situation like we just did. Okay, so just want to throw those out there because we can come back to that as the talk goes on. But if we come back to here and say, where are we with global warming? Well, I mean, at least we're still in sieve for the most part, right? Although we've got some people who say it's too late. There's a lot of people in the community who say it's too late. I'm of the opinion that it's not too late, but man, we have to start thinking about really extreme behavior change of some sort. And I'm going to suggest a behavior change that you might not suspect. Well, you might suspect if you know me, but you might not have suspected if it wasn't me. And we'll talk through it. But let's talk through what we are doing. So if we look at this situation and we try to explore the problem space, what could we do to have something? Well, one of the questions we could say is, well, we know that a lot of the problem is from emissions. Now I'm going to highlight here, it says carbon emissions. This is what you hear everything about, carbon footprints, blah, 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 blah. The worst villain is methane. There's more carbon, but methane is more nasty. Just kind of keep that in your mind. Methane does more damage to the atmosphere than carbon does. We seldom talk about that very much, which is kind of interesting. But we do talk a lot about carbon emissions. And to the extent the world, the political world especially, is focused on anything for global warming, it's carbon emissions. And so we say, okay, we think carbon emissions are the villain. What can we do? Well, let's look at where they come from. And here's the sorts of behaviors they come from. And so often we're targeting things like transportation, right? Electric cars. We're trying to find ways of making our transportation not burn fossil fuels. We might also be looking at sort of stuff you buy, in the sense that we look at industry and we say, we don't want you producing so much emissions from your plants and stuff. Why are they producing that? Well, typically because they're giving us something we're buying, right? And so we can try to have things like limits on how much carbon they can emit, a carbon tax. If they do more, they have to pay money, which you can use, etc. Those are the approaches we've been using. I want to bring you up to food here a little bit. 14%. I'm going to tell you right now, I don't believe that number. And you'll see why as we go through. That seems to be a high underestimate of the potency that our food is having as a negative factor on the environment. Partly that's because methane isn't being considered, but partly that's because food is all food. Vegetarian, meat, etc. They put that all together. You're going to see when you break things out, that looks a little different, and suddenly there's a different villain at play. But that's where we are. So it's all about getting rid of emissions. How are we doing? We're not doing very well. Okay. What I want to argue from this slide is if we leave this in the hand of our politicians and our governments, and if we're going to try to do this through policy, insisting that industry changes in this way or that way, it's not a very successful approach. It hasn't been a successful approach in a lot of other things, and it certainly doesn't seem to be working very well here. Politicians love to get together and make promises and say what they're going to do. But then trying to get industry to do it, which is a highly political thing, right? We have government parties that are in support of business, and some are they're not anti-business, nobody's anti-business, but some people really want to take the side of business on things, and anything that cuts into profits or cuts into potential jobs becomes very contentious. So we have all these political fights, you have like Trump pulling out of the climate accord altogether, etc. And what we're kind of seeing is, well, if we look at how well we're doing after all these pledges were made, it's not good. We're still having a temperature increase, and 2.7 degrees is a lot. It's a major temperature increase for the planet. So it doesn't look like this approach is working too well. Do I think we should stop doing this? No. I don't think we should stop doing this. I think that the people of the world have to be very vocal, but I think we really, if we're going to challenge global warming, if we're going to have a chance at it at all, it has to come on us, on the public. We have to kind of work together and do something that will have an impact. What can you do? When people talk about what you can do as a person, we get things like this. We don't need to go into all the details of these things. By the way, anytime I present anything here, I have the URL up top, and I will make the slides available. So if you want to dig deeper into any of this afterwards, you're welcome to do so. But they just say things like, first of all, speak up. Talk to your local politicians. Tell them the environment's important, blah, 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 blah. Be a voice. Be an activist for the environment. Power your home with renewable energy. Okay? Weatherize, weatherize, weatherize. Stop your home from leaking heat and stuff. Invest in energy efficient appliances. Reduce water waste. Okay, I call things like this the little things. Okay, and I think they placate people. Go out there and do something. Like buy an electric car and you can feel good that you've done something maybe. Or, do some of these things. Get better appliances in your home. Do I actually believe any of these things will have any major impact on global warming and the climate crisis in general? I don't think so. These, when you look at how much of an effect any of these have on the relevant things like emissions, it's not very big. And we need a big effect. We need to do something dramatic. We're past the time where we're just little changes will do it. On this list, and this list, by the way, has like 10 or 11 items if you go to the actual website, but I want to focus on the 6th item on the list. And I want to point out, first of all, this is the 6th item mentioned. So it's kind of low on the list behind these sorts of things. And then I'm going to highlight something about how they do it. But let's just start with this one first. Number 6, actually eat the food you buy and make less of it meat. Approximately 10% of U.S. energy goes into growing, processing, packaging, and shipping food. I think that number is an underestimate as well, for reasons you'll see with respect to other data. But nonetheless, about 40% of the food just winds up in the landfill. We, these sort of first world countries, waste on average about 40% of the food we produce, which is kind of sad in many ways, but it is what it is. So if you're wasting less food, you're cutting down on energy consumption. So the more you actually consume the food you use and then theoretically buy less because you're not wasting it, then less has to be produced, and that can save some energy. Okay, how much is that going to affect climate change? But then they add this little thing at the end. Almost an afterthought on the end of a 6th point of what seem like little things. But I'm going to tell you this is the big thing, okay? And I'm going to tell you why in just a second, and I'm curious what you'll think about that. And since livestock products are among the most resource intensive to produce, eating meat-free meals can make a big difference too. Just kind of, oh, by the way, you could also try eating meat-free meals. Just kind of thrown out there again as an afterthought of a 6th thing. One of the questions I have for you, and this is with respect to human problem solving, is, well, we'll come to, but why are we so focused on emissions from industry while we relegate this to an afterthought of a 6th point in a list of little things you can do? So let's explore this a little bit. and get you thinking about it. And then we'll eventually get to the issue of the role of science. So first of all, meat is a horrible source of food. You know, what's food? Why do we eat food? Well, we eat food primarily to get access to nutrients that feed our body, that keep our body healthy, give us the vitamins we need, give us the minerals we need, etc. You know, including things like protein. We'll talk about that. But if you look at meat products, meat and dairy products, let me explain to you what you're looking at here. So on the one on your left, this is going to be calories, whereas this is going to be protein specifically. So let's start with calories, and let me just walk you through what you're seeing. And let's start with that top bar, that whole milk. What that's saying is that if you look at a cow producing milk, and you say, okay, I got some milk, how many calories? Now, calories are the food energy, right? That's how much sort of food energy you're getting. You get 24% of the calories out of a cow that you put in. So a way of saying that is the cow has to eat 40 calories for any 10 calories of milk you're going to get. You've got 30 calories just being lost, okay? And that's the good meat and dairy. Let's go down to the bottom of the list, beef. For every, let's say, 100 calories you get from a piece of beef, that cow had to consume 50 times that, right? 5,000 calories for you to get 100 calories. It's just not, the sort of thought there is, well, why don't you just eat what the cow's eating? You'd get 50 times as much calories available. Now, we don't want to eat grass, obviously. I'm not going to suggest to you we all eat grass. But the point there is that these are very inefficient. You're pouring a ton more calories in than you're getting out when you're getting your calories through these sources. And also, of course, protein is one of the big things. If you ask a lot of people, why do you eat meat? They'll say, well, because we need protein. And meat is a great source of protein. It is a great source of protein, absolutely. Certainly not the only source of protein, as we'll talk about. But it's a great source of protein. But even on the protein side, you see these same trade-offs. Eggs you have up there, that the hen has to consume 4 times the protein to produce 1 unit of protein. So it has to consume 4 units of protein to produce 1 in terms of the eggs, the protein that you get from eating eggs. So yes, eggs have good protein in them, but it's a very costly way to get it, to have to go through the chicken, so to speak. And again, that's the happy story, right? That's the 25%. That's the only wasting 3 times as much as you're getting story. As you go down to something like beef again, 4%. Now, basically for every 1 gram of protein you get from a beef source, it consumed 25 grams of protein in order to give you that. So very inefficient way to get our calories and our protein. Just throwing that out there. Okay, fine. What's any of this got to do with the environment? I got into this whole animal thing, as you guys probably suspect, on more of an ethical basis, on a sort of that's the path that went down. But when you start thinking about these issues, you realize there's sort of 3 battlefields where you can talk about things like eating meat or not. One is certainly the ethical one. One is certainly the health thing. Is eating meat healthy or not? Generally, it's not, by the way, but things like fish products can be, at least. And so you can talk about that. But the third one is on the environmental front. And it kind of freaks you out when you start looking at this, that it's the right answer seems to be the right answer on all 3 of these battlefields. And maybe it's this one that is the most sort of unexpected until you start to think about meat production. So here are, it says 5 ways. I'll show you all 5. I'm going to really focus on the first 2. So let's go back to that carbon footprint thing, the emissions kind of thing. Remember the food had only said 14%, and I said that seems really weird and low to me, because these are the sort of data that we see from a lot of UN reports and other very, very respectable sources. So The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that livestock production is responsible for 14.5% of the greenhouse gas emissions, so that's the low estimate, while other organizations like the World Watch Institute have estimated it could be as much as 51%. Let's be clear what we're talking about here. We're not talking about the farmer with the cows out in the field. And some cow at some point, they decide, okay, we're gonna slaughter this cow and have meat from it. We're not talking about traditional farming methods. 98% of the meat consumed in the so-called civilized worlds is produced through a process called factory farming. Okay, these animals are crammed into a small space. They live a horrible life. The best day of their life is the day of their death, probably. And because they're all in such a small space, and because they're all producing waste, we have a whole lot of manure that builds up. And that's really a huge problem when it comes to emissions. So those 300 tons of manure aren't just disgusting, they're responsible for 37% of the agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. Manure and its management in factory farm lagoons produce large quantities of methane, a gas that warms the earth 20 times faster than carbon dioxide. Again, carbon footprint, carbon footprint. Well, let's talk about methane, because methane's like worse than carbon, 20 times worse than carbon. That's a pretty significant multiplier, and that's what the manure and such produce in big quantities. Add in transportation and the fuel used to grow the feed and livestock, and we're talking about a large contribution to emissions here from just the production of animals, production of meat, essentially. Also, something we don't even usually talk about when we talk about the carbon stuff, you hear the problems. You're probably hearing of droughts that are happening in the western part of the United States, and there's a big worry about water supply in a lot of places. Do you know, if we just kind of jump down to this step here, 87% of all fresh water is used in agriculture. Now, some of that's vegetable stuff, right? But a lot of this is to water the animals, to give them water. So when you take into consideration that it takes 100 times more water to produce a pound of animal protein than a pound of grain protein, 100 times more water to do a pound of meat protein than a pound of grain protein, then we're using a ton of water just to keep our animals watered. So again, it's not only that they're consuming a ton of food in order to give us a little bit back, they're consuming a ton of water at the same time. And if we instead went to the plant-based, we would have all the calories and all the protein and be using a whole lot less water. Okay? Very kind of clear connection. There are other things, I'm going to go through these a little quicker. But habitat destruction, which is part of the environmental crisis, quite often places are clear-cutting forests to make grazing lands for livestock. And once you clear-cut that forest, now you're wide open for mudslides and all sorts of things, other things. So obviously, you know, it's eroding habitats, and it talks about how a lot of orangutans, pandas, things like that are being impacted by the deforestation and stuff that's going on. There are these dead zones. Kind of weird just to know about these things. So when all this manure from the factory farm seeps into the ground can't process it all the horrible toxins in the manure. So a lot of it ends up in the water supply, and it can congregate into these dead zones where basically any animal that ventures into that, there's not enough oxygen anymore in the water to sustain life. So in a sense, the fish is drowned. They go into this piece of water, there's not enough oxygen in that water, and it kills off all sorts of marine systems. So here's an 8,500 square foot dead zone, which has virtually killed off all marine life that entered it. This is just one of the other aspects that come from this factory farming. And of course, cleaner air, because that manure produces the methane, et cetera, hydrogen sulfide, all these other toxins, and so it would be better. So the point here is, wow, what if we just stopped eating meat? Wouldn't that be a pretty big thing we could do? It sounds like a pretty big thing. Is it just Jordan's? It's not just me, at least. If you look online, you start poking around, you will find many, many sites like this that are not just somebody saying, hey, do what I do, you know, do this vegan thing, but that are connecting to the latest scientific research, a lot of the latest scientific research. And so this is, I've got this hyperlinked here, and I'll just flip to it for a second. We're not going to go into it in detail, but this is talking about the most recent study, and this will outline in detail a lot of the stats that I've given you about different negative effects of all these things. Now we're into the ads. So you'll see all sorts of things, but this is the best study that's ever been done on this issue, on the impact of meat consumption on global warming, and the conclusion is it is the biggest thing we could do would be to just stop eating meat. So let's go to psychology now. Why is that such a big deal? We know like a lot of people have done it. Pythagoras did it back in the day, right? Pythagoras insisted that all of his followers do it. Pythagoras kind of had a cult, by the way. He was a really interesting dude. If you ever want to check into weird historical figures, Pythagoras was a cool, weird, mystical figure. But he insisted on vegetarianism in his day. And you know, a lot of people have embraced this and have lived fine with this, but there's always been about 80% of the population that has not gone there. So vegetarianism, you know, has been anywhere from 15 to 20%. It depends where you go, of course. There's parts of India where are purely vegetarian. I want to go to one of those places one day, by the way. I'd love to be in a place where I'm surrounded by nothing but vegetarians. It would be really kind of cool. I will make that happen. But why aren't we hearing about this? You know, there was, do you guys know Al Gore, you know, with The Inconvenient Truth, the original movie that started people really worrying about these issues? When Al Gore was confronted with this, said, hey, Al, you really care about the environment a lot, right? Yeah. Do you eat meat? Yeah. Will you stop now that we show you the detail? Oh, I don't know about that. You know, Mr. Environmental Movement is a big meat eater. And so we have a resistance. There's something about food that is really special to us. And just saying, you know what, there's all this food available, but let's just take some off the plate. Literally. You know, let's just say there's some we won't eat, and you can still have all the rest, and there's all sorts of great food you can eat. And we're like, I don't know about that. Why? Get back to here. Okay. Why do we live in a world where the data suggests there's a relatively easy thing we could all do to help with the global warming, but you're not told that, by and large? Instead, you're told, focus on emissions, which is really hard because you can't do anything about emissions anyway. You can do minor stuff, you can do little things, but that's really, you know, something that has to happen at the country level, at the political level. Why aren't we being given actionable ideas about what we should be doing in terms of our diet and the impact that that could have? Food is special. So let me just talk, let's just have a couple of polls here then. And I'll also look at your questions while we're doing this, but let me just start this poll. This is my sort of fun troublemaking questions. This is one of them. Okay, given everything you just learned, all the data I just throw out to you, you're convinced, right? If I ask you this question, are you now going to leave this classroom and never eat meat again? Where are you at? I don't expect you all to say you will. I would gladly become a vegan if it weren't for fish. Okay, someone mentions that. Thoughts on lab-grown meat? How could food possibly affect global warming in any way? So I hope we've answered that one. But I love that question, right? Because that question reflects our ignorance of a super powerful lever we have to work with. But most of us don't know about it. Thoughts on lab-grown meat, by the way? I mean, there's a weird thing that happens when you're vegetarian for a while. For me, there was really only one meat I missed, and that was burgers. I liked burgers. And now, of course, there's so many plant-based burgers that's perfectly fine. That itch is scratched. Everything else, I don't want anymore. Like, I don't crave the idea of sinking my teeth into flesh. So I don't need some sort of form of simulated flesh. Thank you very much. But I do think these options are good. In terms of helping people in a way we'll talk about later. The more we could come up with meat-like non-meat options, Plant-based meat options, the better. So we'll talk about that. And maybe lab meat is one of them. Meat is love. Meat is life. Excellent. Okay, let's see where we are here. Yeah, well, possibly. I got some possiblies. That's cool. Excellent. This is a lot to ask, right? This is a lot to ask somebody to change their eating behavior and to stop eating something that they've eaten all their lives. I'm surprised I've only got 8 in the You've Got to Be Kidding. That's cool. But yeah, we see with the D's, like, yeah, I don't know. All well, all good to hear, but so let me just ask you this then. If you could try to capture the challenge of not eating meat in one word, what would that word be? It doesn't have to be one word, but just the reason just so you have a sense, we're going to do a word cloud, and if you do multiple words, I think it treats them all as individual words. So if you tried to say, I like the taste of a hamburger, then it would be I like so just say hamburger if you want to do that. Or you can cram them all together with no spaces, and then you will get your whole phrase there. But if you can capture it in one word, what the challenge is, why is it so hard for people to give up eating meat? What is that one word you would use? All right, we're getting a lot in. I really want to be a vegetarian, but my family eats meat too often. Yeah. We focus more on emissions because meat eating has become a luxurious item. So that's kind of interesting, by the way. I'll mention this. One of the core problems that becoming vegetarian has had for my wife and I, we did it together, which makes it real. That's an important point. We can talk about that. But on anniversaries and stuff, what do, right? You go to that fancy restaurant you wouldn't normally go to, and you're willing to pay a whole lot more money for a meal. Well, what are those meals you pay a whole lot of money for? Filet mignon or something like that. When you give up meat, on those special nights, you're like, what do we do? You want to go have some more falafel wrap? Or there is no sort of luxury vegetable item. I wish there was. And I would like to think if more people were vegetarian, we would get vegetarian restaurants that were high cuisine, really good vegetarian dishes. You can find them now. I know some places in San Francisco, but in Toronto, there's a few places that are vegetarian, but it's hard to find that item. So meat does play that sort of role. You're right, it is sort of a luxury item. Okay, let's see what we got here. All right. Weakness. We'll come to that one. So the idea is if a word was used a lot, it becomes bigger. This looks like you guys are all using different. So I like growing up with it. Excellent. We'll talk about that. Influences, cultures, pressures, craving. So we have this other side of craving. There must be like a taste or something yummy. Biryani keeps showing up, by the way. Apparently biryani. I must have stopped eating meat before I had easy access to biryani because I haven't had it. But it showed up yesterday too, so it's obviously very good. Yeah, nothing. Indoctrination. I like that as well. Okay, so now let's walk into the psychology of this question. And I'm going to talk about 3 bases, but I'm not going to talk about the first 2 in a lot of detail, just to cover it, just so we're thinking about it. But tradition or habits, misinformation, and what I'm going to call implicit superiority. And it's the 3rd one that I will focus on because that's where I think my community, the scientific community, really needs to step up to the plate. And so I want to focus on that argument. But let me start by saying, and I'll tell you a story. There was somebody who used to work with this course as well. She heard me talk about my vegetarian stuff over and over, and she's from a Lebanese family. Lebanese? Yeah. And she said to me, Steve, I hear what you say. I get it. I understand totally. But you don't understand. Every weekend, my family gets together en masse, and everybody brings food. And eating food together is what we do as a family, and that food includes a lot of meat. And you are expected to eat the food prepared by other people and enjoy it. And if I were to walk into that context and say, I'm not eating meat, I would be a social outcast. People wouldn't like, what's wrong with you? You know, they just wouldn't understand it, because traditionally, that's just the role that often food plays. Food is really central to our rituals as humans, to our interactions as humans, and for most of us, that involves meat consumption. I'm of Dutch origin, right? Dutch people have meat for breakfast, lunch, and supper. They have literally cold cuts for breakfast with their cheese and eggs. They're like opposite. They're like, you know, like if you could be an anti-vegan, they're kind of anti-vegans to a large extent. So I grew up with meat, potatoes, and vegetables in every meal. Those are the meals I knew. That's what I knew as a meal. It's really hard for us to change our habits. So I mentioned here William James. William James is the psychologist who most discussed the power of habit. Not so much for bad. We often talk about breaking habits, bad habits. William James was big on build your own good habits. If you intentionally create good habits in your life, if you always take your car keys and every time you come home, you insist on putting those car keys in one spot, and if you can just do that for 3 weeks, I'm going to put these every time I come home in that spot, you will see your body will take over. After those 3 weeks, you won't even have to think about it. You will put them in that spot, and you will never lose your car keys again. And this is the kind of thing William James said. These habit forces are really powerful, and they can make your life really easy. If you build the right habits, you have to work at first to build them, but then the habits take over. The problem, of course, is once a habit is firmly entrenched and established, it's very hard to reshape it. And eating habits are like that. It's really, really a challenge. So when I say to you it's a big ask, you know, will you leave this room and become vegetarian? Even if you said, yes, you've convinced me, Jordans, I'll do it. Well, now when you leave this room, you've got to start figuring out what are the things I eat, what are the other options, where do I buy these things, do I need recipes, and you're going to fail. You know, sooner or later, you're going to say, I just want a burger right now, and it's going to be too much work. So this is why I added, and I feel kind of cocky and self-conscious about doing this. William James is like a huge figure in psychology. I'm just this psych dude, but I made it look like I have some sort of equivalent status by putting my own quote there. But this is an important quote I'd like you all to think about, and I haven't heard other people voice this. I believe that it should be okay. We should be comfortable with one another being in one place cognitively but a different place behaviorally, assuming you're trying to get your behavior in line with your cognition. So what the heck do I mean by all that? What I mean is I myself consider myself cognitively a vegan. Okay, that's what I consider the right way to live. That's who I want to be. I'm not there now. I still eat cheese. I'm having a heck of a time getting away from cheese. Just about everything else I can get away from. But cheese keeps pulling me back a little bit. So behaviorally, I'm a vegetarian. Cognitively, I'm a vegan. I know I will get there. So I think it's okay for someone to say, I think this is the right way to be, and I'm working on moving towards there. But I'm not all the way there yet. We seem to have this notion that once somebody says this is the right way to be, they'd better be that, or they're a hypocrite, and we're going to ignore them. And I think we have to leave room for people saying, I'm in a process of change right now. And so I know where I want to get to, and I'm on my way. And it may take me years to get there, but we should be okay with that. And so I argue that a lot. I hope that you might leave this thing thinking, maybe I could eat a little less meat. Maybe I could try that. Maybe I could skip a few days, see what it was like, etc. But this is a very powerful force. And when you ask people to change their eating habits, you're asking a lot. And we would really need to support people to do that. Misinformation, I'm not going to talk about this too much, except we'll do this sort of funny thing. You know, there's this notion of, we saw the word weak, this association between vegetarianism and weakness. Now, where does that come from? Well, it probably comes from protein, right? We know that protein builds muscles. We know that meat is rich in protein. And so we tend to think, oh, if we're not eating meat, we're not getting protein, and this will be, I don't even know, we tried to figure out what it said on the bottom there. Maybe some of you guys can. But this idea, oh, this is what's going to happen to us. Our skin is shrinking. My teeth are going to hurt. My hair is falling out. I'm so weak I can barely stand. I'm so hungry. I've got diarrhea. I've got no money because rice is a luxury.
I think it's a
Think it's what?
It's a sound, like a
Oh, you think it's just, because rice is a luxury. Okay, whatever. So this is the notion, right? Now, I always take this personally. Take it personally in the sense that I think, if I'm going to stand in front of you guys and say I've been a vegetarian for, decades, I certainly want to look like a strong, non-weak, pathetic individual in front of you. I'd like to, have some energy and some strength. But don't take it from me. Take it from Torrey Washington. So this guy's he's on a mission to kind of defeat this stereotype. He's a bodybuilder, obviously, but he's been a vegan since 1998, and yet he's a competitive bodybuilder. And what he's just arguing is, yeah, you need protein to build muscle mass, but there's lots of protein out there and lots of sources. But yes, if you stop eating meat, you have to find these sources. And that's where the habit thing comes in, right? Because you already have things you buy naturally, and now you got to change all that. You got to relearn eating, relearn shopping for food, relearn cooking. Again, a lot to ask. But vegetarians live longer than meat eaters. All of the data suggests, there's always, by the way, let's just talk about that. Vegetarians live longer than meat eaters. What did I just throw out at you there? It's sort of a correlation of a sort, right? Because we're not randomly assigning people to be vegetarians or meat eaters. If we could randomly assign people and then watch them for 20 years and look at their health, that would be great. But the problem is we don't randomly assign. People decide to become vegetarian. Quite often the people that decide to become vegetarian, a lot of them do it for health reasons. And if they're doing it for health reasons, they're probably also doing things like working out more and living a healthy lifestyle in general. So if they go on to live longer, is it because of the food they ate? Or is it because of the kind of person they are and the general lifestyle? So you don't know for sure, but I can tell you vegetarians live longer than meat eaters do by a significant amount, and all of the health data suggests there's no negative health implications. You do need to, there's really two nutrients you have to worry about. Well, one is iron. So especially if you're female, you have to have your iron checked if you're vegetarian, and you may need to supplement. You may need to take a daily iron pill, basically, to compensate for it. If you're a male especially, but sometimes a female, you may need B12, vitamin B12. I need B12. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I put a couple of drops of B12 under my tongue in the morning because I can't, what's called, leach it enough from vegetables. Some people can. They can get the B12 out of vegetables. Depends on your body. My body doesn't do it very well, so I have to supplement. But that's it. That's all I do is a little bit of B12, and I feel strong, etc. I just don't buy any of this stuff. But let's talk about this, because this is the point I really want to emphasize that connects to what you guys have been learning in the chapter 2. You hear about implicit biases, right? We say things like, hey, somebody might be interacting with, like it could be me, interacting with a female, let's say, or interacting with somebody from another racial cultural group than I am, and I may be acting in biased ways that I'm not even aware of. So one example sometimes people use is maybe I say, hey, does anybody have questions? And a bunch of you raise your hands, but maybe I pick the males and ask the males what their question is. And I don't know I'm doing this consciously. I don't think I'm doing this, but a lot of the women in the audience might say, have you noticed that the guy always picks males, or he always picks white people, or always etc., and that this could be some bias that's in my behavior. Well, I'm going to argue there's a bigger bias of a sort that's relevant to this whole argument I've been telling you, and where science needs to take a more proactive role. I'd like to start with this crazy question to ask you. If a family member of yours was going to die of some disease, but if you could prevent that by killing some number of rats, how many rats would you be willing to kill to save your family member? Enter a number. Really kind of weird question to ask you, right? A weird question when you think about it. Take a look at your questions as we go. Go watch Game Changers on Netflix. Power of it. Yeah, okay, cool. Game Changers. So someone's talking about a Netflix show, Game Changers, that shows, I assume, that vegan athletes doing really well. Won't we always have an abundance of food? It's general to have more food than not enough. I feel that's a big reason for the high wasted percent. Okay, we'll stop. We'll think about that a little differently. Okay, let's see where we are here. I see some other questions coming out, which is cool, so I want to have some time for them too. But let's go here. And this was a really silly question. So I argue there's really only two answers to this question. Now, obviously, there aren't. There's some people who think my family member's worth 2 rats, or 3 rats, or 5 rats, or some number of rats. Here we go. So I argue there's 2 answers that are rationally justifiable. One of them is 0. You could say every life form deserves its own chance, and we shouldn't take one life to save another, so to speak. So you could say no rats, or you could say every freaking rat in the world. Like my family member is just more important than any rat. I can't say there are 57 rats worth or 300 rats worth. I love them so much I would kill every rat on the planet if that's what it took to bring this, give this person life. It's a weird question because it does get us thinking about sort of how we think about animals in relation to humans. Of course, we have ideas about this that come from religious texts. And so this is from Genesis, from the Bible. By the way, I hadn't seen this for a while, and I read it yesterday, and I was struck, I don't know why, I was struck by the use of plural for God. And God said, "Let us make man in our image." I thought, God speaks as though he's a plural, does he? I guess he does in this. This must have just been the way people spoke at the time. But I thought, wow, it sounds like God by committee of a sort, which is kind of interesting. But this quote, make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the fowl of the air, the cattle, over all the earth, and every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. What does this say? Well, according from the religious perspective, we are special, right? We are spirits in the material world. Back to a little bit of that. We are in God's image, we are made in God's image, and the whole world of creation is for us to do with as we please. Okay, that's a very strong species-centric position here. And that's, aligns because within faith, that's the concept, is that we are special in some way. So we expect this sort of thing from a faith context. It's been hit a couple times by science, right? So the classic example would be Copernicus, right? And the whole notion that the Earth is not the center of the universe. All religious scholars up to that assumed everything was revolving around the Earth because the Earth contains us and we are in God's image. And so, of course, everything is revolving around us, kind of like this view suggests. And when Copernicus started saying, you know what? The Earth is just one of a bunch of planets and we're revolving around the sun. It's the sun that's in the center of the universe, not us. That was hard for a lot of religious scholars to accept because it was kind of a step back. To me, it's very important because it's a step towards saying, hey, you humans, maybe you're not as special as you think you are. That should be the role of science, right? It's one thing from a religious perspective to just argue something like we are special. But in science, I argue that this notion that we are better, that we are special, is perhaps the most concretely embraced in science than we see it anywhere else. This notion of our implicit superiority over all other form of life, I argue, is not presented anywhere as clearly as it is in our Code of Research Ethics. I mean, that scientific Code of Research Ethics basically says, this is what it's okay to do to a human, this is what it's okay to do to an animal, and you can do a lot of nasty things to an animal that if you tried to do those to a human, we'd say, no, that's not ethical. But we consider it ethical if you do it to an animal. On what basis? So that's an important question because science is all based on rationality and doing things in accord with data, evidence-based practices. Okay, so if we're going to assume that animals, for some reason, that it's okay to do things that it wouldn't be okay to do to a human, what is the rationality? What is the database? What is it that this animal lacks, but we have, that makes us worthy of a better ethical standard? What's that difference? I ask you. If you believe it's ethically justifiable to do research on animals that would be considered unethical if performed on humans, can you capture in a single word what it is that humans possess but that animals lack that makes it ethically rational that we be treated better than they? What is it about humanity? Now remember, we have people like Darwin, arguing that humans aren't special, right? That humans are just another species of animal. We may be special in terms of our complexity and the complexity of our behavior. We may be sort of an extreme on this animal continuum, but we're not qualitatively different, according to Darwin. And so what is it, this difference, that scientists think makes it okay? All right, we only have 32 here, but let's move along. Nothing. Cool, I like that one. This is where things get kind of hard on the head. You start thinking about these things from an ethical perspective. And you say, intelligence. Okay, if it's just intelligence, there's some pretty stupid people. In fact, we're all pretty stupid when we're babies. Is it okay to do research on babies? Because they're dumb. Well, no, it's still not okay to. Well, they have the potential to become intelligent. Oh, okay. So how about demented people, like near the end of their life, that no longer have the potential? They're losing all their intelligence, and they don't even know their name anymore. So they're basically living an animal kind of life. Can we do research on them? No, that wouldn't be right. Well, okay. What are some other things? Surely there's a consciousness there. I don't see a consciousness. Yeah, okay, there's a consciousness there somewhere. Being aware of yourself, that you exist. We're all aware of our existence. Well, this brings up two things. One is, do we know animals are not aware of their existence? Well, in fact, a lot of the data that we have to look at that suggests that some animals are very aware of their existence. And the other ones we're just not sure. So we don't know. But even if it were true, why does an animal that's self-aware deserve a better treatment than one that is not? And so it becomes a real challenge to think, what would that thing be that would make one life form deserve a better treatment than another? When all of this practice began, it was highly controversial. The notion of vivisection, I've told you this word before, it's an important word to tear apart so that you think about it. Vive means alive, section means what it sounds like, to section, to cut into pieces. Vivisection means cutting living animals while they're alive into pieces so that you can see how the machine works. That's how animal research started. And right from the beginning, you're seeing debates here from 1907, etc., about should we be doing this? And I think this was important. I think the debate was important. One of the arguments I'm going to make to you is this should be a continuing debate. This should always be a debate. And one of the things that concerns me is the silence. Now, in this debate, I've always liked this guy, Jeremy Bentham, as someone to make you think about. He's just a philosopher. He's just a philosopher. He was a very powerful and prominent philosopher. But he boils it down this way. The question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk? So he's going after intelligence. He's going after communication here. But can they suffer? So his argument is, if you're causing intentional pain, if you're intentionally causing pain to an animal that you know will feel the pain and will suffer, that is unethical. And you shouldn't do that. And that should be the line. Can they feel pain? And we should not inflict pain on something that we know can feel the pain. Now, of course, René Descartes argued that maybe they don't feel pain, right? So we have that argument we could go through. But for my part, when I think of universities and when I think of students like you going through, my worry is this. And it's become sort of a role I feel I need to fill. It's the reason I chose this talk for this talk. Do not indoctrinate your children. Teach them how to think for themselves, how to evaluate evidence, and how to disagree with you. This is what I think universities should be doing. We should not be telling you what's right or wrong, and we should certainly not be implicitly telling you what's right or wrong by just showing you one path. Here's how we do research, and yes, it involves animals, and there's all these cool things we do, and just acting like there's nothing to even talk about or think about here. That's indoctrination. when you just bring somebody into a process and you act as though that process is completely and utterly obviously the right process. And you just bring them in and you do not invite them to think deeply about it. You do not signal that there's issues that should be thought about. I think we need students to be thinking about these issues. I have no problem with any student going into animal research as long as they've thought about stuff. I do have trouble when they do it when they haven't even thought about these issues because it's never been raised. This is a very extreme quote, and I'm not suggesting quite this extreme, but nonetheless, Bertrand Russell, when the state intervenes to ensure the indoctrination of some doctrine, it does so because there is no conclusive evidence in favor of that doctrine. Why are people not bringing this up? When you take your courses, why will they not bring this issue up? Because it's a hard one to defend, right? They don't want to talk about it in the detail that I'm talking about it, because then they have to explain the basis of this double standard, and there is no rational or data-based way to do that. And so instead, they don't talk about it and just act like it's right, and that's the beginning of indoctrination. So I worry about indoctrination from that level, but I also worry about this issue back to the climate crisis. So how the heck did we get here from the climate crisis, and what does this, okay, all right, I'm not even going to do this. I'll just put this up for a second for you to look at, but I'm not going to focus on this. I'm just going to go to the climate crisis. We can come back to this if we want. Okay, I forgot about this too. I'll throw that up quick. There's another big issue with this approach. A lot of people say it doesn't work. You know, I told you about that animal model of depression. I told you about animal models of epilepsy. That's how we do this research. We begin by trying to create a version of the disease in an animal. So first of all, it's an animal, not a human. So the disease, even if you had the right disease, it may or may not work like the human version does. But secondly, how do you give that animal the disease? If it's something like AIDS, you can inject it with AIDS and you can be pretty sure it has AIDS, okay? But if it's something like depression, and you do a learned helplessness thing, have you really created a model of human depression or not? So you can argue, is the model any good in the first place? But then, once you do a treatment on that animal with a model disease, and maybe you even find the treatment works, does it then extend to humans when you now move that treatment to humans? And we have a bunch of people here saying our hit rate in that regard is abysmally small, abysmally low. We know of the successes, and there are some successes, but we don't realize how low the hit rate is. I'm never a big fan of what's called appeals to authority, just putting on quotes, from people. But what's striking about these people is who these people are, right? A lot of these people were directors of the National Institute of Health. These were high-ranking people who saw all of the animal research data on a regular basis, and after seeing all of the data, all of the research we're doing to try to cure diseases using animal models, this is where they are at. So we have things like the history of cancer research has been more a history of curing cancer in mice. We have cured mice of cancer for decades, and it simply didn't work in humans. So, the whole process may not even be the best way to do science. There may be better ways. I want to just give you this option to think about for the future, because you guys are the future. And we have this habit, it's something called functional fixedness. When we do something a certain way long enough, we start to think that's the only way to do it. That's the right way to do it. And we just fall into that. And that's my other worry with this animal research approach. It's like science thinks that's the only way to do medical research. But it's not. And there may be some really cool, powerful ways in the future. So let me throw this idea by you. Let's say cancer is the thing and you want to try to cure cancer. What if we did the following? Every patient with cancer, we have a really good database, and we have the doctor record all the information they can about that patient. Age, gender, anything they might know about their genetic materials, whatever we know about that patient. Patient history, full patient history. We document everything we know about the cancer they have. We document everything about the treatment we give. And we document the outcome of that patient. Imagine every doctor was doing that for every cancer patient, and all that data was building up. And now you mine that data. What you might find, and it's almost a random chance thing, it could be almost a random chance thing, but you might find, People of this sort who have that cancer that are given this treatment do well. Why? I don't know. I'm just a data miner. I just find patterns in the data. But the pattern in the data says if it's that kind of person and they have that kind of cancer, you give them that kind of treatment, they're going to do well. You scientists can now go figure out why. You can go ahead and figure out what's going on in the body that makes that true. I don't know why that's true, but it's true. That could be a much more powerful way to find effective ways of dealing with medical disease in general than this trying to create the disease in an animal and then trying to cure the disease in the animal and then hoping that cure extends up to the human. You know, the current approach is not necessarily a very good approach, and it's preventing us from thinking about other approaches. And so there may be better approaches. So again, what does all this all have to do with global warming, and what's my point here? Last slide, tying it all together. See how it goes. What I'm trying to argue, and what I tried to give you the pieces of here, is to say that if we want to keep our privileged place in this planet, I believe the only way that's going to happen is if we all do something. And I think the key thing that we all need to do is develop a much more respectful interaction with the other living beings on the planet. Eating them, breeding them, putting them in a factory farm, and eating them, I don't consider a very respectful interaction, and it also seems stupid to me on a bunch of levels from the data that I've showed to you. So I think a critical step is going to be humans realizing this more generally and adapting their diet. I think that will be one powerful lever we have if humanity shifted to plant-based foods. By the way, Einstein said the next evolution, which is a funny word to use because it doesn't fit, but anyway, the next evolution of the humankind will be when we all move to a plant-based diet. Einstein also became vegetarian later in life. So here's where science is letting us down, though, in my mind. How do we expect the general public to give up their bias against other animals when the core of our rational selves, the scientific community, which is where the rational, data-driven things are supposed to come from, when the scientific community institutionalizes the fact that animals are not as good as humans, that they don't deserve the same treatment? That ethical code institutionalizes that superiority, and it does so in a very explicit, concrete way, and in my mind, a completely unjustified and unethical way. I believe this is a critical domino that needs to fall, that the scientific community has a responsibility right here and now to the public, and that responsibility is to take a hard look at this approach and hopefully to ultimately say, you know what, it doesn't even fit with what we believe. You know, one person said, if scientists believe Darwin, if they really believe that there's no qualitative difference between humans and other animals, like Darwin argued, if they believe in evolution theory, then they shouldn't have two different standards for animals and humans. Those two things don't fit together, and they don't. I'm on the Darwin side. I think we need to have one ethical standard that applies to all living beings. We could talk about what my vision would look like. I didn't really want to get into that a whole lot today. I just want to make this argument that I think the scientific community is in a critical position right now and doesn't even know it and doesn't even talking about it. But that we should be getting at this issue, we should be being very public and out there about saying, hey, this is what we believe about the relationship between humans and other animals. And once we get our house in order, then we can be a little more preachy to other humans about saying, hey, you know, let's move towards a more plant-based diet because that's going to have this powerful effect, etc. But I think the scientific community has a critical role to play. Wow, that was a kind of a long, complex argument. Thank you for hanging out with me. Basically going to stop there.